My name's Sally Warhaft. We have, of course, another Sally here. Sally Neighbour is the executive producer of Four Corners, the award-winning author of 2 books on terrorism and Islamic extremism, The Mother of Muhammad and In the Shadow of Swords, on the trail of terrorism from Afghanistan to Australia. Sally previously worked as a foreign correspondent in Hong Kong and China. She was a senior reporter for Four Corners. She's hosted Late Line. She's written extensively for The Australian. And her Helmer's Four Corners EP was described in the Financial Review just this week as a gold Walkley factory. Please give Sally a very warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Jamie Tarabay is also a foreign correspondent and author of A Crazy Occupation, Eyewitness to the Intifada. Jamie's worked in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Northern Africa and the United States. She was formerly the Baghdad bureau chief for NPR News and a senior staff writer at Al Jazeera America. And she's currently the senior editor for national security and tech at the news website Vocativ, and she's based in New York. Welcome, Jamie.
Thank you.
So the topic today discuss the growing influence of ISIS and more generally the challenges of reporting on global conflict. It seemed to me to be 2 quite separate and really large topics. I'm just going to reframe it ever so slightly to get us into our conversation, and I hope and I'm sure by the end of it we will have covered those 2 very big strands. So I want to just put it a slightly different way, which is to say that the war against ISIS is simply the most difficult war to ever be covered by foreign correspondents because they're targets, and to ask each of you to just first of all respond to this proposition. Sally.
I think it's true that it is the most difficult war that there has been for correspondents to cover, and as a result it's not getting covered. So there are virtually no journalists in Syria and Iraq, at least from Western mainstream media. The ABC won't send anyone to Syria and won't send anyone to Iraq except to the safest areas. And there's good reason for that, because journalists are targets now. You know, in the good old days, journalists used to consider themselves not to be targets in conflict and generally weren't, but there's been a big change to that. And so journalists are targeted for kidnapping and for killing. You know, kidnap for ransom is one of the biggest money spinners for Islamic State and various other groups. And so, you know, the tragic corollary of this is that the conflict is just not getting covered. And so we have a very shallow and simplistic public debate and discussion about what's going on there.
Jamie?
I do agree that it is difficult to cover ISIS, but I do also want to say that it's not the first time that we've had to really sort of confront a militant group. Or that journalists have been at risk. I mean, I was talking to Charlie Glass, who was kidnapped and held by Hezbollah in the 80s in Beirut, and a Serbian photographer who I know who was mock executed during the Kosovo War. I think for us, really, things really sort of began to change once Daniel Pearl was executed, and I also think the introduction of the internet gave these militant groups the ability to reach their audiences without us. Up until that point, even Bin Laden invited reporters, at least Peter Bergen and the editor of Ashaq al-Awsat, to interview him, seemingly without any risk to their person. So the access was difficult. But now we are really living in an age where the media is actually a deterrent to them putting out their message and maintaining their narrative, and as Sally said, we're also a great big ATM machine for them. So there's all sorts of reasons why ISIS is not being as covered as well as it should be.
Journalists being targets, it is obviously not the first time that they have been targeted, but what's different about it, Sally? What's other than the fact that, of course, it's probably the first time that we've seen people beheaded on film, and is it that extreme nastiness of it as well that's sort of frightened bureau chiefs and stopped media institutions, big ones at least, from sending people in?
Look, it's all of those things. You know, when I was a correspondent back in the 90s and covering conflicts like the war in Cambodia, for example, you know, there was this kind of what seems now like a quaint convention that journalists were more or less, you know, out of bounds. So, you know, we used to wear the flak jackets with press on the front and used to put masking tape on the top of the car saying TV. Based on the assumption that if they knew that you were press and they knew you were TV, that they wouldn't attack you. In the same way that, you know, we used to wear the Australian flag, or some journalists used to, on the assumption that that would make us safe from attack, which clearly it doesn't these days. So, you know, it was a little bit like the Red Cross, a TV badge or a press badge. And there were, of course, cases like Jamie's mentioned where journalists were targeted, but it wasn't a frequent or routine thing. Whereas now I think, you know, Islamic State, they use beheadings as a propaganda tool and a recruiting tool. It's actually one of their major recruiting tools, that they film these videos and, you know, put them online. And this is a way that they gain recruits across the world. So, you know, of course, it's not just journalists who are being kidnapped and killed in that way. Lots of other people have. But it has become a part of their modus operandi. And, you know, propaganda is so important. It's so central to their aims and the way they operate that, you know, stopping the alternative narrative, which is the one told by Western journalists, is absolutely critical, so that, you know, their narrative is the one that, you know, predominates.
What else is it with ISIS that makes this so challenging? What's at the heart of it that makes it so difficult? The idea that you would not, in 2015, be able to send journalists in to cover the conflict of our times?
I think, you know, if you're going into a hostile environment, you need to be able to know how you're going to navigate your way through it. And if ultimately, really, the fact that journalists are not considered to be non-combatants, they look at you like you are part of the war, you are a target. So you go in there knowing that there is, and you're not armed. So journalists are never, by and large, you know, have any weapons on them. And if you go in with a security team, they have weapons on them. So you are defenseless. And, you know, I mean, it's almost like the memory is so short, but, you know, I have very vivid memories of being in Iraq in 03 and 04 and 05 and 06 and 07, when people were kidnapped and put in orange jumpsuits and had their throats sliced in front of cameras, you know, by pretty much the same people who are still doing that today. There is definitely something more, so it's instant gratification, the way that they do it, the way that they reach out publicly on their forums to ask for ideas on how to execute people, the way they circulate talking points to people to be able to explain why they set a Jordanian pilot on fire. There's definitely a savviness with the way they communicate that, you know, that we as journalists would completely undo. And there's not even a question. If we were to ever meet anyone like that, they would just be like, you're gone, you're dead.
And executing individuals, journalists or aid workers or whoever they are, is a way of amplifying their power in an extraordinarily powerful way. I mean, Islamic State doesn't seek to carry out mass casualty attacks like 9/11 or any of those, the other attacks that followed September 11. But, you know, killing one individual on camera by cutting their throat creates as much terror and fear as, you know, killing 2,000 people by bringing 2 skyscrapers down. So, you know, for them it's an incredibly powerful tactic. You know, it really gives the impression that their power is much greater than it really is.
And having the execution delivered by a man in a British accent is very powerful, because if you don't understand what they're saying, it helps to almost just imagine that they're not actually people in a way. They're not people, but if this, you know, jihadi John They're calling the sort of the most brutal of these the men who were holding the journalists were called the Beatles because they had British accents. That terrifies people because it could be someone that they know. It's not that easy to dismiss it. It's like that belongs in that region. It's not something that I need to be worried about.
And similarly, using guys like, the young Australian boy with the orange hair who was known as the ginger jihadi, in those propaganda videos where they're appearing in, a big group of 50 guys with AK-47s and the full kit. And he, in his Aussie accent, is, delivering this scary message to the West. I mean, a young guy like that with no training and no knowledge would be pretty useless to a serious insurgent group, except for the propaganda value. And, that's the amazing value of people like that for them.
We'll move on shortly to the repercussions of the lack of stories that are able to be got over there. But as an executive producer of a flagship program in Australia, you as a senior editor, how do you think about ways of overcoming this? You're not prepared, obviously, to send one of your correspondents in there. Do you think about? They must want to go. Some of them, I'd imagine.
Most people don't really want to go. Some people would like to go. The correspondent in the Middle East at the moment, Matt Brown, who's a fabulous correspondent, would like to get closer to the action, but it's just too big a risk, really. And media organisations have become much more risk averse for good reasons and for bad reasons. It is frustrating for journalists sometimes when you just want to go and cover a story and tell the story, and management, has become really quite risk averse. But in the case of Iraq and Syria, there's really good reasons for that. So it's really frustrating. We've been looking. On Four Corners, we run about a dozen bought-in programs each year that come from the BBC or PBS or wherever, and we're on the lookout for a really great story on Islamic State from the inside. And there's none.
Doing it either.
No one's going in. I mean, Vice News, the American Vice News, went in and made this fantastic doco series, but since then I haven't seen anything really good from inside. So it's a real bind. I think the way around it is to kind of start, crowdsourcing material from inside. And I keep thinking we must do that, but we just haven't got around to it yet. But there must be, people who are filming stuff on their mobile phones, posting it, gathering it, and bits and pieces of that stuff do get out. But of course, that's incredibly dangerous for the people who do it. So, you've got a duty of care toward them too. You can't have people, you can't not send your own people in and rely on people on the ground, because they would face, just as much danger.
And for that reason, freelancers that are going in, major news institutions won't buy their work, most of them. Jamie?
Yeah, no, I think that Reuters, for example, and other sort of major organisations have basically said, we're not going to encourage you, so we're not going to pay for it. But one of the things that we've been trying to do at Vocativ is to at least try to counter. I think the more people understand about what life is really like, in the Islamic State, the more they'll, sort of the veil, is pulled away, and we have this ability to be able to sort of delve into the deep web to be able to pull up stuff that is like just ground sourced. There's a Syrian activist group called Raqqa is being slaughtered silently that does a lot of videos. The images that ISIS does not want you to see of people in Raqqa, purportedly the capital of the Islamic State, lining up with buckets for water and food, and just the idea that they are trying to perpetuate this idea of a perfect state that has healthcare and charity for the poor and clean roads and electricity and things like that, and anything that we can sort of find ourselves to put out there to sort of counter that message, at least to be able to illuminate what it really is like for people who go out there. And every time we get something like they release one of their special forces training videos, we'll ask a Navy SEAL to look at it, and after they've laughed their asses off at it, they'll actually tell us this is preposterous. So it does sort of because, you know, otherwise you see these guys in black and they're like running through water and you think, oh my goodness, these people are like really trained well and they're really equipped, and that guy's like, you know, by the time he's finished drying himself off, he's like dead. So, you know, I think taking away the mystique that they are working so hard to cultivate is something that we've been really trying to do all this time as well.
It seems to me that if you can't get people in there, then the alternative is to be really looking at people that have been and got out. And of course that is incredibly complicated now in Australia, particularly because of the Q&A drama. Sally, tell us how you responded to, well, the government's response to the infamous question and by Zaki Mallah, and whether it created a difficult situation for people in your position who might actually want to get these guys talking as an option.
I thought the whole thing was a ridiculous beat-up. I mean, after the event, you know, people like myself who are executive producers of programs make decisions all the time about you know, who to invite on and who to interview and who to talk to in your programs, and it doesn't mean you're necessarily giving them a platform. I mean, you have to be careful about that because sometimes you are, but, you know, we need to expose and explore and dissect issues and events and stories, and you need to hear from a whole range of people to do that. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think in hindsight you could say, well, you know, maybe there was potentially, you know, a security risk because Zaki Mallah could have turned out to be a Manharon Monas, the guy who everyone had previously thought was, you know, a harmless fruitcake, who then, you know, did the horrendous siege at the Lint Cafe. But I think if I'd been in the position of Peter McAvoy, the EP of Q&A, I would quite likely have made the same decision to have Zaki Mallah come in and ask a question. He's been around for years. He's kind of a serial media nuisance, you know. He's always in the media. He's an attention seeker. He has always, you know, as far as we know, been relatively harmless, apart from the kind of strange and, you know, attention-seeking events that led to his arrest initially. But I mean, I think that, to me, that whole incident was just a reflection of the fact that, you know, the people who would like to destroy the ABC will use any little occasion or incident that they can to do it.
Does it then make it more difficult for you, though, to make decisions potentially about who you bring into, say, a Four Corners documentary, or are you able to just put the Q&A thing to one side? And
look, I think we have to be prudent and acknowledge, you know, the political environment in which we're operating, which is one where the ABC is under severe scrutiny, and in particular because of the News Corporation position on the ABC, which is that they would like to destroy the publicly funded broadcaster because we are direct competition to them, and therefore any kind of political concerns about what the ABC is doing, which are also, you know, often just confected, get amplified in a quite ridiculous way. So we have to be prudent, we have to acknowledge that's the world we live in. Also, the ABC is taxpayer funded. We have to be absolutely rigorous and forensic and conscientious and scrupulous in everything we do that spends taxpayers' money. So, you know, those are parts of the reality. We also have to, you know, take risks and try and be as fearless as we can about just doing the job that has to be done and the journalism that has to be done. Because if the ABC is not doing it, no one else in this country is going to be doing it. Thank you.
Jamie, what have you learned about the war with ISIS from people that have come back?
Well, I haven't really been paying attention to anybody who's actually been lucky enough to come back. But I firmly believe that there's no way that anything is going to happen with ISIS as long as Bashar Assad is allowed to remain where he is. And I think that as long as everyone ignores that Assad actually kills 7 times as many Syrians as ISIS does, nothing's going to change. And, you know, when you listen to, I get an email every day from the DOD telling me that they have launched X amount of airstrikes in Iraq on ISIS targets and X amount of airstrikes on Syrian targets. And the head of the Chairman Chiefs of Staff, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said at one point recently that American jets will fly over ISIS targets and return without having dropped anything. So, you know, $2.5 billion later, 8,000 airstrikes, 1 year into this military action, and ISIS still controls half of Syria, a large part of Iraq, and Obama pretty much admitted that he does not have a cohesive strategy to tackle ISIS. You know, the Turks have decided to use the opportunity of becoming involved by bombing the Kurds as equally as they've been bombing ISIS. No one talks about what they're going to do about Assad. And as long as they don't have that conversation, we can talk about ISIS till the cows come home. It means nothing.
I want to come back, Sally, to your first response about the repercussions of not having journalists in there, and the ability that then gives governments to really simplify this war so that you end up hearing cliches and very thin one-liners, opportunities to create or attempt to create cultures of fear that may or may not be reasonable, and you know, lines, you know, the death cult and so on. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. Yeah, look, I think that's, you know, one of the most regrettable results of the fact that we can't get in, and for the most part we can't cover that war, is that as a result we have this really simplistic, basically ignorant public discussion about ISIS and, you know, what it is and the extent of the threat it poses toward us. So, you know, in all the discussion about it, we hear over and over from the Prime Minister it's a evil death cult. I mean, I think, you know, that might be reasonable to describe some of the things it does as being akin to what an evil death cult, if there was such a thing, might do. But, you know, it's not the only thing about ISIS. ISIS is actually a functioning state in parts of Iraq and Syria, albeit an inept one, as Jamie says. It levies taxes, it provides services, it provides a kind of bizarre level of security for its people. It is, you know, as David Kilcullen writes in his excellent quarterly essay, which I recommend if you're interested in the subject, ISIS differs from Al-Qaeda in that it is essentially a state-building exercise. Al-Qaeda was a terrorist group. ISIS is essentially a state-building enterprise, and they have built a state. And so, unfortunately, because we can't get into that state, you know, we can't reveal that it's inept and desperate and miserable and the people are, you know, suffering and have to queue up for buckets of water. So what we're left with is this kind of reduced debate which tells us nothing about Islamic State, inflates the danger of it and inflates the danger of it to us. So we're also told by the Prime Minister they're coming to get us. And, you know, that sort of discussion continues to flourish because we can't get in there and just bring the much more mundane truth about ISIS to the public. So, you know, that's really quite frustrating. And you know, politicians capitalise on that. You know, it suits them. It suits them for us to be really terrified. You know, ISIS has killed very, very few foreigners, and that's not what it seeks to do. They're not coming to get us. There will be, you know, mad people and, you know, vicious, nasty criminals who latch on to their message and their ideology and then carry out, you know, atrocities in their name, as happened with the Limp Cafe siege. But that guy had not had any contact with ISIS. He had just kind of latched onto them and then made that the emblem for, you know, the awful thing he did. So, you know, it's a real frustration, and it's central to this really kind of dumbed down political and public discussion we're having at the moment.
Is it like that in the States where you're based, Jamie?
To an extent, there's definitely there's definitely a sense, and I think because there have been so many, there are not very many foreigners, but the foreigners who have been killed by ISIS have been done so publicly, and because the US is carrying out these strikes and it is costing so much money, there is definitely a focus on it. But I do think that so much of the explanations are facile, and now particularly since I'm having so much fun watching the presidential campaign. And everyone's blaming everyone for creating ISIS, which is my favorite question of all time, so please don't ask me that question. But, it's when the Iraq war was happening, there was a lot of rhetoric, but it was all very much designed to serve things up in black and white. So people could understand us versus them. It was very monolithic, and it was just easy to digest. And it was nothing like that. It was a lot of grey. And we were still there to be able to explain, in this area, these people are fighting these people, and these people, and to be able to sort of, it's too complex for most people to be interested enough to understand. And so the people who have been able to get their message across are the ones who've been able to simplify it in a way that most people will get and are willing to sort of digest. And that, that is a problem. And it also comes into this whole idea of whether it's anti-Islam, and the idea that this is not the first time a radical ideology of a group of people that has wanted to exterminate another group of people has not ever happened before. Like, we've never seen that before. So it's just a challenge to try to get people to understand the root causes, the idea that ISIS just kind of arrived out of nowhere, that it was just sort of implanted in Iraq and Syria. It just gets too complicated for people to get how difficult it will be to defeat and contain. And the idea that the surge worked, which is another one of my favorites, and that if we just flood the country again with more troops, then this will all be over again. So there's a lot of messaging going on, and with political campaigns, it just becomes more heated, but also more simple.
Do you have a sense of an approach that would be better?
I do, but I'm not in charge. No, I just, I think the reality is that, look, everyone, I watched Anne-Marie Slaughter talked about this at the Aspen Ideas Festival. The idea of, it's better to contain ISIS than it is to, ratchet up and send people and put boots on the ground and all that stuff. And as she said, and very succinctly, we have seen this movie before, and there were 100,000 and so US troops in Iraq at one point. They managed to subdue or, work out a truce with the Sunni tribes on the premise that the Iraqi government was going to sort it out for them and start to, build some kind of relationship. So the Americans were operating in a vacuum. The Americans would operate in a vacuum again, and more so, we'd be asked to do it too. So, the idea that we would all be asked to do something yet again for something that would have the exact same result is just... What is that thing that they say about the act of doing something and expecting different results? Like, what's that saying?
Failing to learn from history.
Yeah, but it's also like stupidity, right? Yeah. But I think that given if you look at the region and you see the role of Syria, the role of Turkey, the role of Iran, and if people wanted to contain and eliminate ISIS, they could, and it would require a much greater effort than they're carrying out right now.
And the other thing is that there's no doubt that ISIS is a vicious, savage regime which is oppressing its people, but there's a lot of those in the world. The North Korean regime is vicious and has been oppressing and starving its people for a very long time. We're not invading North Korea. Right. The Chinese government has been oppressing and, destroying the culture of Tibet and Xinjiang in Western China for a very long time. We're not invading China. So, why are we so fixated on Islamic State? It's a really nasty regime, but it doesn't necessarily threaten us directly. It does threaten world peace and order, there's no doubt about that. But, why would we invade those countries when we're not invading, you know, various other places where equally savage regimes are in place?
Well, it's part of this is the simplification, isn't it? And you wouldn't have to read very widely to, you know that apparently the death cult is coming to get us. And so much so that, in fact, on the streets of Melbourne, we were informed yesterday morning for a brief time that we actually needed our border security force apparently on every corner with tram conductors in order to make sure people who presumably don't look like me randomly had their visas in check. An astonishing, I mean, it was just, I just didn't even believe what I was seeing as I read it. And as it unfolded, it was, of course, cancelled even before the press release the press conference was given. It's been pointed out by some correspondents that it seems to be part of a government idea of putting out a sort of security something every week, or, you know, let's go with this. And amazing and terrific response from the people of Melbourne to make sure that that was stopped in its tracks. Sally, what did you make of that, and how do you connect it to all of this?
Look, I think it is another example of, you know, what happens when you have this kind of ill-informed and somewhat hysterical political and public discussion about the level of threat to all of us. You know, somehow then the next day you've got these border force cops in their black outfits, you know, ready to start patrolling the streets of Melbourne. I don't think we know yet who ordered that, so it's not clear whether it was just a cock-up by some kind of mid-ranking police or security officer, or if there was some political directive that led to it. But so it'll be interesting to see, you know, when that plays out, and that, you know, that's going to be a story for a while. But you know, we do know that the government has sought to make national security a major issue, and that the government feels that it's on very strong ground when it's, you know, arguing about national security and, you know, purporting to protect us. And the opposition is in lockstep with the government on that. So, you know, both major political parties have determined that it's in their interests politically to be seen to be tough and strong on, you know, protecting us all. I doubt that we're really at risk outside Flinders Street Station.
It's not our foreign correspondents, of course, that this is up to, but how do you think our domestic journalists are going at really digging into these stories as they go? Because for me, as that unfolded yesterday, I thought, I wonder if this will still be around by Monday. Obviously,
oh yeah, I
think it will too. But the news cycle, it only has so much time for each story, and then if there isn't an answer, it can drift away. Do you think that at home journalists are doing enough digging, enough follow-up?
I think they are, really. I mean, you know, I think the Australian news media is pretty good by and large. I mean, we've got lots of crappy news media, but I think, you know, by world standards, I think we've got a pretty good news media, and I think, you know, they're now right onto this issue of national security being exploited for political gain. You know, it's taken a long time. It's taken since September 11, really, and we all kind of, you know, for quite a lot of years after September 11, I think, you know, most people felt that a level of security was important, that there was a danger to all of us. You know, we had the Bali bombings. You know, there have been terrorist plots uncovered in Australia. So there is no doubt that there is a risk from terrorism to Australia, including here. But I think, you know, people have become much more sceptical about, you know, the measures that are needed to contain that. And I think journalists have taken a while, but I think they're doing a reasonable job now of chasing that up.
I'm just really happy she said cock up. I'm gonna take that one home today. I mean, I think that I do feel like it wasn't just in Australia. The American media, I mean, everyone knows the utter failure of by 90-something% of the American media to just walk lockstep with the Bush administration following 9/11, not second guessing any of the motivation, any of the sort of the dictates that came out of the war on terror. It was very frustrating for those of us who were in the Middle East at the time to see the real lack of scrutiny and skepticism, particularly when the drums for the Iraq War began. That was very disturbing to see, because it really leapt from Afghanistan to Iraq, and just how anyone made that connection was, I actually feel like we still haven't seen any accountability. A lot of these people still manage to make lots of money from all their books, and it's funny, when the whole ISIS thing kicked in last year, there was a story out saying that if you were not a neocon, you couldn't get on TV because no one wanted to hear from anyone who wasn't a neocon. It was amazing that there's still this, gravitating towards this point of view because it's familiar and it's comforting. It's wildly wrong, but this is it's just that's the frame of mind. And there's still a lot of partisanship in American media, and you can tell, if you pick up a newspaper, I mean, I do, because I've spent so much time, sort of consuming American media, that I know what I'm going to get when I even look at the name on the story, let alone the newspaper. It's kind of this wildly divergent from this almost like conspiracy theorists, the government is out to get you, journalism to everybody wants to kill us and we have to always be alert, and it's difficult to sort of find the middle ground that is actually, it's not as bad as that, but actually here are the things that you need to pay attention to. And these are all the rights that are being taken away from you the more that you allow the government to enact X, Y, and Z acts. So there's definitely... I don't know if I can say that they're more aware and skeptical than they were 10 years ago. I'd like to think so. But, the Bush administration behaved one way. The Obama administration is notorious for cracking down on leaks and just making sure that its messaging is what is out there, and, just combating any kind of, adverse point of view. So it's really sort of being able to watch that firsthand is it's interesting right now. It's a challenge. I think that everybody has, and the problem is that it's not really a public service if the job of the journalist is to be able to inform, not to tell people how they should be thinking. And not to be able to say this is what you need to know because I'm telling you this is what you should be afraid of. And it's just the public is being let down by that.
And of course, there's the never-ending problem with resources. And Sally, you mentioned earlier the idea about getting somebody to trawl through all the things that are, coming out one way or another. But that would require, at the ABC at least, presumably a dedicated staff member to be doing that pretty much all the time. Is that about right?
Well, for a while, yeah. Resourcing is an issue. I mean, all media organisations, particularly the traditional media organisations, are, under real pressure financially and staff-wise. As you know, the ABC lost 300 or 400 staff last year. There may be more staff cuts to come, I'm not really sure, but, there'll no doubt be more budget cuts to come. The ABC's become spread very thin. We've now got the 24-hour news service, and we've got a massive online presence, which a lot of resources have been kind of, sort of shifted over to. So, look, resourcing isn't being put into investigative journalism. It's being put into the kind of, ubiquitous 24-hour rolling news and online news. And, that's a good thing in lots of ways. But, we have to kind of fight to make sure that resources at least aren't stripped away from investigative journalism. And so far we're okay, but, it's an ongoing fight.
Can you just tell us, in global conflict more broadly, about the kind of precautions and what goes on in making a decision either as a journalist yourself or being responsible for a journalist as a producer or an editor in going into a dangerous situation? And at what point do you just say, I can't be making this risk, because it's such a fine line, isn't it, between a Pulitzer Prize and losing your head?
It is a very fine line.
Oh, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean that.
I think correspondents used to be a lot more autonomous than they are now, and used to be much freer to make their own decisions about risk. I remember doing a story in Kashmir for Foreign Correspondent, must have been 20 years ago, when I was based in Hong Kong, and it was the beginning of the insurgency there, and the growing insurgency and opposition internally to Indian rule of Kashmir. And Pakistan and India were at loggerheads, and it was seen as a potential nuclear flashpoint. And so we went in there to do this story, and there was a curfew in place. There were soldiers on the streets, it was pretty tense. We were getting stopped at roadblocks and, guns pointed at us. And we wanted to go and interview one of the insurgent leaders, the leader of the main insurgent group. And so we had to go through this elaborate process, which I'm sure Jamie's familiar with, whereby, you meet at a safe house and then you switch cars and you're taken to another safe house and you have to wait, and then you're taken off, somewhere into the woods. And, we were kind of driving around for hours, had no idea where we were. We were completely in the hands of these people. And so we end up at the location where the insurgent leader's there, surrounded by his guys with the masks and the AK-47s. And, it was a classic journalist's girl's own adventure. That's why you become a journalist, to do stuff like that. It was fantastic, and it was a great story. But, I don't think we'd be able to do that stuff these days. It was it foolhardy? I don't know. We had a local fixer. You rely very heavily on your local fixer. The local fixer that you employ is life or death for you, because local knowledge is the only thing that gets you the story and gets you out of there safely. But journalists these days have, the risks are much greater. Journalists are targeted more frequently. Media companies are much more risk averse, for some good reasons. So journalists have much less freedom now, I would say, to make those risk assessments themselves on the ground. There's a lot more involvement by management and, professional risk assessors, and the insurance company gets consulted, and you've got to do safety reports before you go. So there's just a lot less freedom.
You don't go blind. You don't go in there without knowing where you're going and who you're going with. And I think absolutely you have to have people on the ground. You make a lot of friends. Having the language is extremely helpful, because you have to, I found it I don't know how anybody could do it without understanding, because you have to learn how to read a crowd, because everything can turn on a dime, and you have to be able to know how to get out of a situation. Like, that was my mantra when I went to hostile environment training when I was 25. And the first thing they told us was secure your exit. And that has just stayed in my head. Even now when I'm at a concert or, in a restaurant, it's like I still apply that.
So it's over there.
I know where it is. No, I know. But, it's just, you really, the sort of the macro, the overarching is definitely the organisation, your editors, your the people who have to make the phone call to your family if anything happens. But ultimately, you really do have to sort of use your own street smarts to be able to say, I feel confident going down this road. I'm not going to ask you to be responsible for my safety because I feel okay with this. And even that is, you are taking a great big breath and diving in. So it's never easy. I think those car journeys are the most stressful ones, because you're actually so much more exposed in the car than you are at any really other point, because you could get stopped in traffic, you could drive by a bombing, people will see you, and that's a lot of anxiety.
And you have to respect and defer to other people's judgments and fears too. If your cameraman doesn't feel safe, You can't do it. If your driver's saying, we have to get out now, then you have to get out now, even if, there's still a guy there who you desperately want to interview. So you have to kind of respect and allow for other people's expert judgments and instincts as well.
Do you think that Al Jazeera badly let down their journalists in Egypt? And if so, how do you feel about it, and why do you think it happened?
God, I mean, I don't know why it happened, but do I think they did? Yes, I do, and I don't think that anyone would disagree with me. I think choosing to sue the government of Egypt when 3 of your journalists are being held in custody isn't exactly going to calm things down. So, yeah, I do.
Thank you. Going back to ISIS, I think it's important to identify some of the forces that are keeping it going. There is a very important role for the Gulf states in the way that ISIS has developed and the way that it's going on. The reality is that ISIS was certainly at the beginning funded, supported by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United States. As time has gone on, the US has changed its policy, but Saudi Arabia and Qatar have continued to support this group, this organization. And I want to make the point that focusing on
we need a question.
I'll try, yes. I just want to say that focusing on the Assad regime as being somehow that if you remove it, ISIS will be defeated, I really have to tell you, could not be more wrong. The only legitimate governments in those 2 countries, in Iraq and in Syria, are the governments that exist now. Certainly, not the opposition groups. Now, my question to you is, given that these are facts and realities, I mean the support for ISIS, how would you, if you're really interested in getting rid of ISIS, how would you go about removing this, what in my view is a pernicious kind of support for this awful organization?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm going to take issue with the US support of ISIS because I'm not really sure where that came from.
No, I'm not aware of any evidence. For that
I also don't. At no point did I suggest that the opposition groups in Syria would be a better alternative to Assad, and I don't believe that Assad is actually the legitimate government or authority in Syria. Because if you are a dictator, you're there by imposing your will on the people. So I'm sorry, I have to disagree with you about that as well. I do believe that the Gulf allies have to do more. I actually said that I don't think that anyone's doing near enough what they could. I do believe that it is a concerted effort that requires everyone involved to contain and eliminate ISIS. And I don't just say that it should just be Syria. I said Turkey needs to do its part, Iran needs to do its part, and certainly the Gulf allies need to do their part as well. So, but I also believe that because it's going to take all these different groups with all their different interests involved to do this, it's going to take a very long time before we even get there. So, Sally?
No, I think you've got it.
Thanks.
The lady in the red there. Thanks.
Thank you for this informative session. What I was missing, I went to your last session, Jamie.
Oh, God.
Don't say that. It was very passionate.
Oh, thank you.
You mentioned there, and you mentioned again, we're not informed about Assad. I've just returned from actually Jordan and also Turkey, and saw the recruiting that was going on in Jordan for ISIS. And what puzzled me is how little we are informed of the economic circumstances that are happening in Jordan that I saw, which is that jobs have gone, things are getting bad in many ways, I think, in what I can see in the Middle East. So Assad, I was puzzled, where does all this fit? Because the recruiting of women, young women going to ISIS, is one thing that's not mentioned here.
question.
And I didn't feel it was that difficult to report that. Yeah, for instance.
Okay.
And the promises. So my question is, why are we not getting the, for instance, one, Assad power that's operating and not being highlighted? And secondly, the recruiting that's going on all around, which is also on misconceptions, especially of the young women there.
Okay.
You can obviously regarding when it comes to reporting on Assad, and I'm sure Sally will agree with me that mainly Western journalists do go into Damascus, but you have to get a government visa, which means that you are basically under the monitoring of the Syrian government. They know everything about where you're going, who you're meeting with, and so you're unlikely to interview anyone in Damascus who's going to say anything against Assad. And Sally, if you want to talk more about that. Regarding the women, there was actually a really brilliant article in the New York Times last week about they call them the Bethnal Green girls, so the British girls who were 15, 16 years old and went. And, here's the thing. It's like people aren't just being recruited to be fighters. They're being recruited to be citizens of a state. These girls are being told, come here, be good Muslims, help us grow our state, be doctors, be teachers, be nurses. We need you. There was an Australian doctor on a video saying, please, I urge all of my colleagues to come and be part of this. And one of the biggest recruiting tools is that they're there taking care of the Syrians who Assad is killing and maiming. And if they think that as it is their Muslim duty to go and help their fellow Muslims, of course they're going to do it. So there's all sorts of aspects of who's coming. Whole families are going because they believe, and it's part of being a Muslim. Like, you want to live in a country where Islam is, the rule of law, and this is a society, and you can practice your religion freely.
I think that...
Well, they'll marry them. That's the thing. And it's like, you get to choose. And they do. They get to choose.
No, I'm sorry. Sally?
I was just going to say that I think that the coverage of that conflict, particularly within the Australian media, has been skewed toward the scary, easy bits to cover. So we actually have had a lot of coverage of recruitment, particularly recruitment of the relatively small number of Australian young guys who've gone over there. There's been a lot of coverage of that. There's been a fair bit of coverage of the women who've been recruited in Australia, who've gone over there, become, brides of ISIS. We've had much less coverage, exploring the economic background to it, the, economic, cultural and sort of political reasons for the conflict, what's going on in the ground in Syria, what the Assad government's up to. It's partly because people won't go in, so we've had very few journalists, Paul McGough being, the outstanding exception, who's not afraid to go anywhere, but, there are very few others who are actually going in on the ground and exploring those broader issues. So it's partly because of the danger, problems of access, and partly because I think the Australian media is much better at domestic coverage than international coverage because we're quite insular. And also, we're lazy, and it's much easier to cover those kind of scary recruitment stories than the much more complex stories of why is it happening.
Anyone on this side, on the right? We want Melbourne Writers Festival balance here.
It's the left from their perspective.
That's right.
So why is it happening?
Why is what happening?
So you're saying we're avoiding the questions of why it's happening and focusing on the easy ones. So what's the answer to that? Why is it happening?
I can't answer that. I was actually just going to the point that the lady up there was making about, why Australians aren't telling us what's going on with Assad and what's happening on the ground. Why is it happening? I can't be answered in, a forum like this. There are many, many factors and reasons to that. One reason historically is that, the invasion of Iraq created a whole new monster. So, that was a key factor in the awful mess we've got now. But, You know, it also goes back to, you know, European colonisation of the Middle East, the arbitrary borders that were drawn up, the failure of the Arab Spring. You know, there are so many factors that, you know, you'd have to talk about 100 of them to have an even adequate discussion.
Last question. The lady in the blue top at the very end there who's had her hand up the whole time. But you'll have to make it quick, please.
It will be a really quick question. I just wonder, as we're getting such a skewed view of what's happening, do either of, or any of you, ever see a situation where the media might actually decide to take a blanket decision to not post any of this footage of beheadings, to basically not act as the oxygen to ISIS's fire?
I think you see that already. I know certainly in the States when the executions started happening that there was almost a blanket decision online, especially on Twitter, to not post beheading photos. You know, ISIS puts out all kinds of execution videos pretty regularly, and we don't publish them, and we don't link to them. You know, and we can describe them a little bit, and most people will do that as well. That we might take a screen grab, but it's just not something we want to give air to, you know, really, because we don't really want to trade on that kind of brutality. And I've seen that a lot in the States, and I don't think there's been like an actual official, you know, conscious decision about it. But I think that particularly when Jim Foley was killed and Sotloff was killed, everyone online on Twitter was just like, please do not post those pictures. And pretty much everyone did not do that. So that was really gratifying to see. And I think it was also just a collective thing that people were doing because it was just so horrific.
And Australian media has taken basically the same position. I mean, mainstream media doesn't show those pictures, and nor should we. I think when the first guys in the orange jumpsuits were killed, we were showing, you know, bits of the video in the lead up, but never, of course, the moment of death. But I think when they started happening again and again, we became much more averse to even running any of the imagery. So, yeah, I think the media's been reasonably responsible about that.
However, all of that is completely accessible online, and
yeah,
I promise
right.
you that you know, many Arab networks are showing it. You know, and I don't know if the Europeans are, but it's not like you can't find it if you want to look for it. So it's definitely available. Twitter is doing actually a really interesting job of being able to shut down those accounts as quickly as they can, and then they have actually tried. This is how savvy they are, is because once they know that they're going to get shut down, they will then go and create a new account, and other people will say, this person that you were following, he's now moved to this Twitter handle. And it's really interesting to watch, but it's something that Twitter has been doing for a while now to try to sort of stopgap it. And it's been very, very interesting to watch.
Well, we will have to leave it on that very, very interesting point. Just as I was thinking, we didn't get to Twitter. There it was, a little bit at the end. You've been a terrific audience, and it's been a really interesting session. I want to thank the Melbourne Writers Festival, but also, again, the Fifth Estate at the Wheeler Centre. It's every second Tuesday evening, so check it out at the Wheeler Centre webpage. Thank you so much, Sally Neighbour and Jamie Tarabay, for such a really interesting conversation. Please thank our guests.
Thank you.